17 years ago, my daughter walked out of my house and told me I would never see her again. She kept that promise for 6,205 days. Then, on an ordinary Tuesday morning, my phone rang, and a voice I hadn't heard since she was 15 years old said 4 words that broke me open. "Mom, it's Danielle. Please." I stood in my kitchen, holding that phone, my hands shaking, because I knew the moment I answered, I would have to face the choice I made 17 years ago, the choice that cost me my daughter, the choice I told myself for almost 2 decades was the right one. I am Patricia Coleman, and this is the story of the worst decision I ever made, and the phone call that finally forced me to answer for it. Before we move forward, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming amazing videos. My name is Patricia Coleman, and before I tell you about the phone call that changed everything, I need you to understand who I was 17 years ago, because the woman I am now would never make the choice that woman made. I was 41 years old, recently remarried after a difficult divorce, raising my only daughter Danielle, in a house I desperately wanted to feel like a fresh start for both of us. I met my second husband, a man named Gerald Foster, 3 years after Danielle's father and I separated, and by the time Gerald and I married, Danielle was 12 years old, still grieving the loss of her original family structure, still adjusting to a stepfather she'd never asked for. I want to be honest about something from the very beginning of this story. Gerald was, by every outward measure, a good man. He had a steady job as a supervisor at a manufacturing plant on the edge of town. He went to church with us every Sunday. He remembered Danielle's teacher conference dates better than I did some years. Our neighbors adored him. My own mother, who rarely approved of anyone, told me at our wedding that she'd never seen me happier, and she was right. After years of a marriage that had slowly worn me down to nothing, Gerald felt like proof that I hadn't ruined my chance at real love. That belief, that desperate need to hold on to proof that I'd finally gotten something right, is what I believe now clouded every decision I made in the months that followed. Danielle was 15 when things started to shift in our house, though I didn't recognize the shift for what it was at the time. She became quieter, more withdrawn, spending longer stretches of time alone in her room with the door locked, something she'd never done before, even during the hardest parts of the divorce. Her grades, which had always been strong, started slipping. She stopped inviting friends over the way she used to. When I asked her what was wrong, she would tell me she was fine, that she was just tired, that being a teenager was hard. I believed her, or maybe I simply wanted to believe her, because the alternative required a kind of attention I wasn't prepared to give. Looking back now, with 17 years of hindsight and far too much therapy, I understand that Danielle was trying to tell me something during those months, in small, fragmented ways that I failed to piece together. She started asking questions that seemed unrelated to anything, questions about whether I would always believe her no matter what, questions about whether love meant choosing someone's side, even when it was hard. I remember one night at dinner, she asked me directly whether I thought it was possible for someone to seem like a good person and still do something terrible. I told her, without thinking too deeply about why she was asking, that people are complicated, that most people aren't entirely good or entirely bad. I had no idea, in that moment, that she was asking me to prepare myself for something she was about to tell me, testing the water before she found the courage to swim into it. The night Danielle finally told me the truth was a Thursday in March. I remember it was raining, because I remember the sound of it against the kitchen window while we talked. A detail that has stayed lodged in my memory for 17 years, the way certain sounds attach themselves permanently to certain moments of devastation. She came downstairs after Gerald had left for his night shift at the plant, and she asked if we could talk. I could tell immediately that something was different about the way she was carrying herself, a kind of forced calm that comes right before someone says something they've been building the courage to say for a long time. She told me that Gerald had been doing things that made her uncomfortable, that had been making her uncomfortable for months, Comments about her appearance that felt wrong in a way she couldn't fully articulate. Moments where he found reasons to be alone with her that felt engineered rather than accidental. A hand on her shoulder that lingered too long. A way of looking at her that she said made her feel like she needed to shower afterward. She didn't accuse him of anything more than that in that first conversation, but even what she described was enough, more than enough, to warrant every ounce of my attention and belief. I want to tell you that I gave her that belief immediately. I didn't. What I gave her instead, in the most shameful moment of my entire life, was doubt. I asked her if she was sure she wasn't misreading things. I asked her if she understood how serious an accusation like that was, how it could destroy a marriage, destroy a family, destroy a good man's reputation if it wasn't accurate. I told her, and I still remember the exact words because they haunt me to this day, that sometimes when families go through big changes, kids look for someone to blame, and that maybe what she was feeling was really about missing her father, about resenting Gerald for not being him. I watched my 15-year-old daughter's face go completely still while I said those words, watched something close behind her eyes that I didn't understand the significance of until it was far too late to reopen. She didn't argue with me that night. She simply nodded, told me she understood, and went back upstairs. I told myself I'd handled the conversation reasonably, that I'd asked the right questions, that a responsible parent doesn't simply accept every accusation at face value. I told myself this for weeks, even as Danielle grew more distant, even as she started finding excuses to be out of the house whenever Gerald was home, even as the version of my daughter I'd known my entire life seemed to fold in on herself a little more each day. 3 months later, in June, Danielle came to me a second time, and this time she was more specific, more detailed, describing an incident that had happened while I was at a weekend conference for my job, an incident serious enough that I cannot fully describe here, but serious enough that any responsible parent hearing it should have acted immediately, decisively, without a single moment of hesitation. I did not act immediately. God forgive me, I did not act at all in the way I should have. Instead, I confronted Gerald directly, and he denied everything with a calm, wounded conviction that I mistook for the honest outrage of an innocent man. He cried. He told me he loved Danielle like his own daughter, that he couldn't understand why she would say something so devastating about him, and he floated a theory that terrified me enough to grab onto it with both hands. He suggested that Danielle might be struggling with something deeper, some kind of emotional difficulty she hadn't told us about, and that these accusations might be a manifestation of that struggle, rather than something rooted in reality. I wanted so desperately to believe him, because believing him meant my marriage was intact, meant I hadn't failed a second time at building a stable home, meant the man I'd built my entire post-divorce identity around wasn't a monster. I chose him. I need you to sit with that sentence for a moment, the way I've had to sit with it for 17 years, because there is no softer way to say it. Faced with my daughter's word against my husband's, I chose my husband. I told Danielle that I'd spoken with Gerald, that I believed there had been a serious misunderstanding, that I thought it might help for her to speak with a counselor about everything she was feeling, framing the suggestion in a way that placed the burden of explanation on her rather than accountability on him. I watched something in my daughter break permanently in that conversation, watched her stop even trying to make me understand. Watched her retreat into a silence that I mistook for acceptance rather than recognizing it as the beginning of a goodbye. Danielle turned 16 a month later, and the distance between us only widened. She started spending more time at her best friend's house, staying over some nights without asking permission the way she used to, and I let it happen because, if I'm honest with myself, having her out of the house made the tension easier to bear. I told myself I was giving her space to work through whatever she was struggling with. In truth, I was avoiding the reckoning I knew, somewhere beneath all my careful rationalizations, was still coming. The reckoning came 4 months later, on a Sunday afternoon in October, when Danielle's best friend's mother, a woman named Renee who I'd known for years through the girls' friendship, called me and asked to speak with me privately. What she told me on that phone call unraveled every justification I'd built for myself over the previous 7 months, and it set into motion the final conversation between Danielle and me, the one that ended with my daughter walking out of my house and telling me I would never see her again. Renee's voice on the phone that Sunday afternoon was careful in a way that immediately told me this wasn't a casual call about the girls' weekend plans. She asked if I was sitting down, and I remember laughing nervously, the kind of laugh that comes from a body already bracing for bad news before the mind catches up. She told me that Danielle had been staying at her house far more frequently than I probably realized, not just weekend sleepovers, but sometimes 3 or 4 nights in a row, and that over the past few months, in quiet moments between the girls, Danielle had told her daughter things that had eventually made their way to Renee, things detailed enough and consistent enough that Renee felt she could no longer stay silent, regardless of how it might affect her friendship with me. She told me that according to what her daughter had shared with her, Danielle had disclosed not 1 or 2 isolated incidents, but an ongoing pattern, something that had apparently been escalating for the better part of a year, something far more serious than the discomfort I'd allowed myself to categorize it as during our earlier conversations. Renee told me, gently but firmly, that she believed Danielle completely, that in all the years her daughter had known Danielle, she had never known her to lie about anything of consequence, and that she found it deeply troubling that I hadn't already taken action serious enough to protect my own child. I sat at my kitchen table holding that phone for a long time after Renee finished talking, feeling something cold and enormous settling into my chest, the specific horror of realizing that the thing you've been telling yourself isn't true has actually been true the entire time, and that your refusal to see it hasn't protected anyone, it's only given the harm more time to continue. I thanked Renee, though I have no memory of what words I actually used, and I hung up the phone and sat in that kitchen for almost an hour before I trusted myself to move. When Gerald came home that evening, I confronted him again, but this time something in me had shifted permanently. I no longer wanted an explanation. I told him what Renee had shared with me, watched his face cycle through the same practiced expressions of wounded denial he'd used months earlier, and for the first time, I recognized the performance for exactly what it was. I told him he needed to leave the house that night, immediately, and he tried, initially, to talk his way out of it the way he always had, reminding me of our marriage, our life together, asking me if I was really going to destroy our family over what he called teenage exaggeration. Something in me, some dormant piece of the mother I should have been from the very beginning, finally woke up enough to tell him that if he didn't leave within the hour, I would be calling the police myself. He left. I want to tell you that this moment, this late and overdue moment of finally choosing my daughter, repaired what had already broken between us. It didn't. When I called Danielle that night to tell her Gerald was gone, to tell her I believed her, to tell her I was so sorry for the months I'd spent doubting her, she was silent on the phone for a long time before she spoke, and when she finally did speak, her voice was flat in a way that frightened me more than tears would have. She told me it didn't matter anymore. She told me that she'd needed me 7 months earlier, in March, in that kitchen with the rain against the window, and that every day since then that I'd chosen doubt over belief had taught her something about who I was that she couldn't unlearn just because I'd finally caught up to the truth. She told me she'd spent months being told, implicitly and explicitly, that her own mother thought she might be lying, might be confused, might be acting out over unresolved feelings about her father, and that no apology delivered after the fact could undo the damage of having lived through that. I tried to explain, to apologize, to beg her to understand that I was scared, that I hadn't known how to face the possibility that I'd married someone capable of that kind of harm. She told me, with a calm that I now understand was the sound of a 15-year-old girl protecting herself the only way she knew how, that she understood I was scared. She said she'd been scared too, every single day, for almost a year, and that she hadn't had a choice about facing it. Danielle came home a few days later, physically, but something essential in our relationship never fully returned. She went through the motions of living in my house for the remaining 2.5 years before she left for college. Polite, distant, careful in a way that broke my heart every single day. I tried everything I could think of to repair what I'd damaged. I found her a therapist. I wrote her letters when talking felt too hard. I apologized more times than I can count, in more ways than I can count, and each time she would nod, tell me she appreciated it, and maintain the exact same careful distance she'd established the night Gerald left our house. The final rupture came the summer after her senior year of high school, right before she left for college. We had an argument, not really about anything specific, the kind of argument that happens when years of unspoken hurt finally finds an excuse to surface. I said something in the heat of that argument I've regretted every day since. Something about how long ago all of it had happened. Something that, however unintentionally, sounded like I was asking her to simply move on from something I still hadn't fully earned the right to ask her to move on from. She looked at me across our living room, the same living room where I'd once told her that people are complicated, and she told me that she was leaving for college in 3 weeks, and that when she left, she didn't want me to contact her. She told me she needed to build a life somewhere I wasn't part of it, somewhere she didn't have to see the face of the woman who chose doubt over her, even temporarily, even 7 months out of an entire lifetime. She told me she would never see me again. And then she walked out of that living room, and 3 weeks later, she left for college, and I did not hear her voice again for 17 years. I want to tell you what those 17 years were like for me, though I understand that whatever pain I carried during that time pales in comparison to what I put my daughter through in those 7 critical months when she needed me most. I tried reaching out several times over the years. Cards on her birthday that were never acknowledged, an email a few years in that received a short, polite response, essentially asking me to respect the boundaries she'd set. I respected it, though respecting it felt like a slow, ongoing punishment I told myself I deserved. I found out through mutual family members, distant cousins who still spoke to both of us, small updates over the years. She'd graduated college, she'd moved to another state, she'd gotten married. Each piece of information arrived secondhand, filtered through other people, because my own daughter had decided, understandably, that I hadn't earned the right to hear these things from her directly. I went to therapy myself during those years, tried to understand the parts of my own history, my own fears about abandonment and failure, that had made me so susceptible to choosing comfortable denial over difficult truth in the moment my daughter needed me most. I learned things about myself in that process that didn't excuse what I'd done, but helped me understand it, the way understanding the mechanics of a wound doesn't heal it, but at least helps you stop reopening it out of ignorance. I never remarried. I never quite forgave myself enough to believe I deserved another chance at building a family, even as the years passed and Danielle's silence became less a wound and more a permanent architecture of my life, something I built everything else around. 17 years is a long time to live with a door you've closed yourself, believing it will likely never open again. I had made peace, or something resembling peace, with the possibility that I would die without ever hearing my daughter's voice again, without ever having the chance to tell her, fully and completely, how sorry I was for the 7 months I chose fear over her. That peace, fragile and hard-won as it was, shattered on an ordinary Tuesday morning in March, 17 years almost to the day since that rainy night in the kitchen, when my phone rang, and a voice I would have recognized anywhere, even after all that silence, said 4 words that broke me open completely. "Mom, it's Danielle. Please." I stood in my kitchen holding that phone for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a few seconds, my mind racing through every possible reason my daughter might be calling me after 17 years of silence, unable to settle on a single explanation that made sense. Her voice sounded both exactly like I remembered and completely unfamiliar, the voice of a 32-year-old woman layered over the 15-year-old girl whose voice had been frozen in my memory for almost 2 decades. I managed to say her name back to her, and then I asked, because it was the only thing my mind could produce in that moment, if she was okay. She told me she was okay, physically, but that something had happened that had made her need to hear my voice, made her need to reach out despite everything, despite the boundary she'd maintained for 17 years, with a consistency I'd come to believe was permanent. She told me her father, my ex-husband, Danielle's biological father, had passed away suddenly the week before, a heart attack at his home in another state, and that going through his belongings afterward, she'd found a box of old photographs, family pictures from before the divorce, before Gerald, before any of what had happened between us. She told me that looking through those photographs, she'd found herself thinking about family in a way she hadn't allowed herself to for a very long time, and that somewhere in the middle of that grief, she'd realized she was tired of carrying the weight of our estrangement, alongside the weight of losing her father in the same week. I listened to her talk, afraid to say too much, afraid that anything I said might remind her of every reason she'd had for walking away in the first place. She told me she wasn't calling to say everything was suddenly fine, that 17 years didn't disappear because of one phone call prompted by grief and old photographs. But she said she was tired. In a way, grief sometimes makes you tired of carrying grudges alongside it, and she wanted to know if I would be willing to talk, actually talk, about everything that had happened, if I was willing to sit with the full weight of it, instead of the abbreviated apologies I'd offered over the years, through birthday cards and a single careful email. I told her yes, immediately, without hesitation, that I would talk about anything she needed to talk about, that I had been waiting 17 years for exactly this chance, even though I'd never allowed myself to believe it would actually come. We didn't resolve anything on that first call. It lasted maybe 20 minutes. Mostly logistics, mostly her telling me about her father's funeral arrangements, about her life in broad strokes. Married to a man named Terrence, no children yet, working as a hospital administrator in a city 3 states away. But at the end of the call, she asked if she could call me again, and something in her voice, cautious but not entirely closed, told me that this really was the beginning of something, even if neither of us knew yet what that something would ultimately become. Over the following 2 months, Danielle and I talked more than we had in the previous 17 years combined. The conversations were careful at first, testing conversations, the kind two people have when they're both aware of how easily things could shatter again. We talked about her father's funeral, about her job, about small pieces of the life she'd built without me. But eventually, gradually, the conversations began circling back toward the thing that had separated us in the first place, because Danielle made it clear early on that she wasn't interested in a relationship built on pretending those 7 months hadn't happened. She told me during one particularly difficult call, to actually understand why I'd chosen the way I had, not because understanding would automatically forgive it, but because she needed to know whether the version of me capable of that choice still existed somewhere inside the woman she was now talking to. I told her everything, more honestly than I'd ever allowed myself to be with anyone, including my own therapist. I told her about my fear of failing at love a second time, about how desperately I'd needed my marriage to Gerald to be proof that I hadn't ruined my own life through the divorce from her father. I told her that somewhere in that desperation, I had made her carry a burden no child should ever have to carry, the burden of being disbelieved so that her mother could avoid confronting an unbearable truth. I didn't try to soften any of it. I didn't offer the excuses I'd offered myself for years, that I was scared, that I didn't know how to process something so devastating, that I'd acted out of confusion rather than genuine doubt. I told her that whatever fear I'd felt, it didn't excuse choosing my own comfort over her safety, and that I understood if 17 years of silence hadn't been enough to make that easier to live with, one phone call certainly wasn't going to fix it either. This is where the heaviest disagreement between us emerged, weeks into our renewed contact, during a call that started calmly and ended with both of us in tears on opposite ends of the country. Danielle told me that as much as she appreciated my honesty, she needed me to understand something I still didn't seem to fully grasp. She told me that my repeated apologies, however sincere, kept centering my fear, my confusion, my difficulty processing what she'd told me, and that in doing so, even now, 17 years later, I was still making her experience about my emotional journey rather than fully reckoning with what those 7 months had actually done to her. She told me that during that time, she hadn't just lost a sense of safety in her own home. She'd lost her fundamental belief that the people who were supposed to protect her would actually do so, and that this loss had shaped every relationship she'd built since, made her cautious in her marriage, made her slow to trust even people who'd given her no reason for suspicion, made her spend years in her own therapy, trying to unlearn the lesson that speaking a difficult truth might be met with disbelief instead of protection. I wanted, in that moment, to defend myself, to point out how much I'd grown, how many years of therapy I'd done, how genuinely different I was from the woman who'd sat across from her 15-year-old daughter and suggested she might be confused about her own experience. But something in her voice, something in the exhausted honesty of what she was telling me, made me understand that defending myself in that moment would only prove her point further. So instead, I did something I hadn't fully managed to do in 17 years of carrying guilt. I simply listened, without interjecting, without softening, without trying to redirect the conversation toward my own remorse, and let her tell me, in full, exactly what those 7 months and the 17 years that followed had cost her. It was, without question, the hardest conversation of my life, harder even than the night Gerald left our house, harder than the night Danielle told me she never wanted to see me again. But it was also, I came to understand later, the necessary conversation, the one that had to happen before either of us could figure out whether there was any real path forward between us, or whether this reconnection would simply be a temporary bridge, built on grief, that would eventually collapse back into the same silence. After that difficult call, there was a period of almost 3 weeks where Danielle didn't reach out, and I didn't push, because I understood, finally, that pushing had never been what she needed from me. I spent those 3 weeks in a kind of suspended anxiety, wondering if I'd said something during that conversation, or failed to say something, that had convinced her the reconnection wasn't worth pursuing after all. I went back to my own therapist during that stretch, someone I'd been seeing on and off for years, and we spent our sessions unpacking exactly what Danielle had told me, not so I could formulate a better defense, but so I could actually sit with the full weight of what I'd done, without flinching away from it the way I'd trained myself to do for so long. My therapist asked me a question during one of those sessions that reframed something important for me. She asked whether I'd ever actually grieved the mother I could have been to Danielle during those years, or whether I'd spent most of my energy trying to manage my own guilt instead of fully accepting the loss my choices had caused. I realized, sitting in that office, that I had spent 17 years oscillating between guilt and self-forgiveness, without ever really doing the harder work of simply accepting, without qualification, that I had failed my daughter at the exact moment she needed me most, and that no amount of growth I'd undergone since erased the reality of those 7 months for her. When Danielle finally called again, almost a month after our difficult conversation, her voice sounded different, steadier somehow, like she'd used the silence to sort through something on her end, the same way I'd used it on mine. She told me she'd been thinking a lot about what she wanted from renewed contact with me, if she wanted anything at all, and she told me something that surprised me. She said that despite everything, despite the very real damage those 7 months and the 17 years of silence had caused, she found herself wanting to try, not because she'd forgiven everything, but because her father's death had taught her something about the cost of unresolved estrangement, about how grief becomes more complicated when it's tangled up with things left unsaid. She told me she wasn't interested in rushing back into a relationship that looked like the one we'd had before everything fell apart. She wanted something slower, something built on the honesty of that difficult conversation, rather than on the comfortable performance of a mother and daughter pretending 17 years hadn't happened. She proposed that we start with regular phone calls. Nothing more, no promises about visits or holidays or any of the traditional markers of reconciliation, just consistent, honest conversation. And we would see, over time, whether trust could actually be rebuilt or whether we'd simply confirm that too much time and damage had passed for anything real to grow again. I agreed, gratefully, and over the following several months, we talked almost every week. Sometimes about difficult things, working slowly and carefully through the specific ways those 7 months had shaped her, and sometimes about ordinary things, her job, her marriage, small everyday details that felt, each time she shared them, like precious gifts I hadn't expected to ever receive again. I met her husband Terrence for the first time over a video call about 4 months into our reconnection, and I could see immediately why she'd married him. A patient, steady man who watched her with an attentiveness that told me he understood, at least in broad strokes, what our family history had cost her, and who seemed committed to being the kind of unwavering presence in her life that I had failed to be. The heavy disagreement between us didn't fully resolve in one conversation, the way these things rarely do in real life, the way they sometimes do in stories. There were setbacks over those months, moments where old wounds resurfaced unexpectedly. During one call, when I made an offhand comment about wanting to visit her for her upcoming birthday, she went quiet in a way that told me I'd moved faster than she was ready for, and she had to remind me, gently but firmly, that the pace of our rebuilding needed to be set by her, not by my eagerness to reclaim lost time. I apologized, and more importantly, I actually adjusted, waiting for her to bring up the idea of an in-person visit herself, rather than continuing to push for something she wasn't ready to offer. That visit did eventually happen, almost 8 months after that first phone call, on the ordinary Tuesday morning that started everything. Danielle invited me to come stay with her and Terrence for a long weekend, and I remember standing at the airport gate in her city, my hands shaking with a nervousness that felt almost identical to the shaking I'd felt holding the phone that first morning she called. When she walked toward me in the terminal, 32 years old, a grown woman with her own life and her own hard-won wisdom, I saw both the daughter I remembered and someone entirely new. Someone who had survived what I put her through and built a life anyway, not because of me, but in spite of me. We hugged for a long time in that airport terminal, longer than either of us probably expected, and I remember her whispering, so quietly I almost didn't hear it, that she wasn't ready to say everything was okay, but that she was glad I'd come. I told her that was enough, that it was more than I'd let myself hope for during 17 years of believing I'd lost her permanently, and I meant it completely. That weekend wasn't perfect. We had one more difficult conversation, sitting on her back porch on the second night, where she told me she still sometimes struggled with trusting that my change was permanent, that some part of her still braced for the possibility that I might, in some future crisis, revert back to the woman who chose comfortable denial over difficult truth. I told her I understood that fear, that I couldn't promise her certainty, only consistency, only the ongoing evidence of showing up honestly, week after week, for as long as she was willing to let me. She told me that was, for now, enough to keep trying. I think about that Tuesday morning phone call often, the 4 words that broke 17 years of silence, the voice I thought I might never hear again. I used to believe the worst moment of my life was the night Danielle told me she never wanted to see me again. I understand now that the actual worst moment happened 7 months earlier, in a kitchen with rain against the window, when I chose fear over my own daughter's truth. Everything that followed, the silence, the estrangement, the 17 years, was simply the long, painful consequence of that single choice. What I've learned, slowly and imperfectly, rebuilding something with Danielle these past several months, is that real repair doesn't erase what happened. It doesn't restore the years that were lost, or undo the specific damage those 7 months caused to a 15-year-old girl who needed her mother and didn't get her. What it offers, if you're patient enough and honest enough to earn it, is simply the chance to become, finally and belatedly, the person you should have been from the very beginning, even knowing it will never be enough to fully repair what your failure once broke.